In arts, and particularly in architecture, what began with the invention of telescope was taken forward in the 18th century by Laugier to find a way to define beauty in a more measurable terms. Today, we use the term aesthetics to make sense of all that we consider beautiful. The word aesthetics is derived from the Greek word aesthetikos, defined as a perception of senses, Aristotle elaborates that in his treatise on poetics, and I quote, "An orderly arrangement of parts which has a beginning and an end, a middle and an end," unquote. However, a German philosopher, Alexander Baumgarten, in the 18th century, appropriated this term, aesthetikos, as episteme aestheticae, or the science of what is sensed and imagined. A science of aesthetics would be, for Baumgarten, a deduction of the rules and principles of artistic or natural beauty from individual taste, a deduction from the whole range of individual taste, which may vary from person to person. Like the mythical Samudra Manthan, to extract Amrit, the magical elixir from the sea. That is to make sense of beauty as something measurable and rational. But for the Greeks, aesthetikos was something bigger. Sense perception as one of the sources of knowledge, a source of knowledge. There is an interesting parallel here between Greeks and the Vedic civilization of India. There are evidences, both historical, archaeological, as well as linguistic, that the Greeks and the Vedic scholars met, intermingled, and exchanged ideas in the court of King Darius of Persepolis. This diffusion of knowledge between two great civilizations shows up remarkably similar notions on this subject of sense perception. The Upanishads mentioned 6 sources of knowledge, grouped in three primary categories: reason, imagination, and perception. Though all are concurrent, perception, where senses are the receptors and experience the result, is accepted by all as the supreme. There is a wonderful little couplet in Hindi which goes something like this. Jahan na pahunche Ravi. Ravi means sun, symbol of reason, rationality, enlightenment. So Jahan na pahunche Ravi, waha pahunche Kavi. Kavi is the poet, the custodian of imagination. Jahan na pahunche Ravi, waha pahunche Kavi. Or Jahan na pahunche Kavi, waha pahunche Anubhavi. Anubhavi is the man of experience. What it says is that imagination will take you beyond where reason can take you, but even experience, which is the result of the sense perception, will take you even beyond that. There is an implicit hierarchy here between reason, imagination, and perception, wherein sense perception is believed to be higher than the other two. I believe the Greek word aesthetikos was also meant in this sense, implying sense perception as a source of knowledge and not a rational science of beauty with rules and principles for artistic creation, as Baumgarten would have us believe. Thus, aesthetic should mean a comprehensive sense of order, embracing both perceptible in the object of art and the non-perceptible in the ideational realm. That is the idea of architecture or art even. Thus, the appropriation of the Greek concept of aesthetic or aesthetikos into a much narrower meaning of episteme aesthetike, or the science of what is sensed and imagined in the 18th century, leaves us with a dilemma. Can a building be studied as formal aesthetics object only? Or is it a vehicle of a particular meaning or a social purpose, a subordinate to a particular task, like this restaurant which serves duck? The building, as Robert Venturi has observed, is a billboard, or rather how he calls it, building board, which announces its purpose. A formal aesthetic analysis is irrelevant. In this case, a formal analysis can easily slip into formalism, where the optical norms, the aesthetic principles of proportions, symmetry, harmony, balance, etc., are the only determinants of architecture. At the same time, being a subordinate to a purpose, like this duck, will reduce it as only an instrument and deprive it of its identity as a work on its own right. What characterizes any work is its identity. But we have also established in the very first session of this series that what it is of any work comes from its design, its formal cause, which makes it complete, whole, and perfect, and whose particular order sets it apart from its surrounding and distinct because of its internal constitution and strong demarcation of its limit. In other words, a man-made world in itself. Now you may ask, what do I mean by setting apart from its surrounding? Does it mean a building has to appear different from its surrounding physical environment? Two great minds have weighed in to answer these questions. And let us see what they have to say. The first is the American philosopher Nelson Goodman, who coined the term world making to refer to art. The purpose of world making, according to Goodman, is to instruct and persuade, to purge, to carry out a catharsis of the emotions. It should affect the minds of the audience for public good. It should edify wisely, consult and comment judiciously, rouse consciousness and criticize. This alludes to the necessary or essential political nature of art. Political because art has always had an antagonizing relationship with culture. By political, Goodman implies taking a public position. Art should rouse consciousness and criticize. The word politics also comes from the Greek word polis, P-O-L-I-S, not police of the law and order kind. P-O-L-I-S. It means the public realm, as in the case of metropolis, the city is a public realm. Politics then is to be and to act in the public realm for public good. For Herbert Marcuse, the another great mind that I was referring to, the French philosopher, is far more explicit about this political nature of art. Marcuse says, as part of the established culture, art is affirmative, sustaining this culture. And as alienation from the established reality, art is a negating force. The history of art can be understood as the harmonization of this antagonism. This means for art, the surrounding world or the context implies the entire culture in which the work of art is conceived and executed. It is both part of this culture as something that is already executed using the tools and the means available, and at the same time must be alienated from it in order for it to rouse consciousness and criticize. Commenting on the sculptor Claes Oldenburg's proposal to erect a monument in the form of a giant peeled banana in the middle of the Times Square, Marcuse has commented, and I quote, "Strangely enough, I think that would indeed be subversive. If you could ever imagine a situation in which this could be done, you would have a revolution. If you could really envisage a situation wherein in the middle of Times Square, a huge banana, I would say this society has come to an end. Because then people cannot take anything seriously. Neither the president, nor the cabinet, nor corporate executives. There is a way in which this kind of satire or humor can indeed kill. I think it would be one of the most bloodless means to achieve radical change," unquote. The Center Pompidou in Paris plays a similar role. And unlike the banana in the Times Square, it is a built. It is located in a neighborhood that was largely built in the 19th century and represents cultural values that determine architecture and urbanism at that time. At one level, it is affirmative of the technological culture of the 20th century. However, it also presents a powerful critic of the values, architectural in particular, and cultural values in general of the 19th century. It also questions the centuries old notions of that which is complete and perfect, like the perfectly shaped human body, both male and female. If the perfectly shaped human body was the aesthetic archetype of the earlier era, and if we have to imagine a similar archetype for this building, it will have to be a body whose innards and intestines and all other organs are all hanging out for public display. The Aristotelian notions of what is complete and perfect are all turned upside down and inside out. It celebrates and monumentalizes, like the banana, all that was trivia, like the service pipes and the staircase, elevators, etc., to be hidden away. Both the banana and the Pompidou Center arouse consciousness and criticize. They are both affirmative of their culture and critique the same culture at once. But both the banana and the Pompidou Center are ordered completeness derived from their inner logic. And in that respect, they constitute world within the world, where the world refers to both physical as well as cultural. There is an interesting point to be made here, that regarding the relationship between the built images and ideas they embody. This relationship is diametrically opposite in architecture and in engineering. Or to put it differently, in science and in art and in science. Pure engineering as science applied in the service of mankind is necessarily bound by the empirical logic and methods of science. This methods of science is to develop concepts, principles, and in general the laws of nature, the ideas, from our experiences and observations, our sense perceptions. But in the process, science does alienate these abstract laws from the living experience of the day-to-day life. It was only on this condition, physical determinism, that modern science has been able to harness the power of the sun, take us to the moon and beyond, and discover multiple vaccines for a deadly virus in a matter of months. And through engineering, science creates images in the form of buildings, bridges, roads, etc., using the structure of ideas provided by science. There exists a direct causality between ideas and images. Ideas, that is science, engender images, things and structures. Ideas precede their manifestation. It was this method of science that architecture was called upon to emulate, to become something more measurable and rational, to be modern. But architecture, as all arts, follow a different path, as can be seen in this very interesting paradox in the work of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, through his polemical writings, projected himself as an ardent proponent of this modern age of science, technology, and industrialization. He passionately believed in that. He actually coined the term, "a house is a machine to live in." He actually created this interesting and very polemical diagram in which he proposed, like a scientific law of nature, that all our past architecture, representing the lived experiences of mankind, can be reduced to simple geometric forms and patterns, both two-dimensional and volumetric, square, triangle, and circle. Similarly, in deducing the 5 points of new architecture, the pilotis, the free plan, the roof garden, the horizontal windows, and the free facade, and also in deconstructing the primary elements of habitation and community living into technological components and then reconfiguring them in new forms, Le Corbusier was following the classic methods of science, of analysis, abstraction, and synthesis in new laws and principles. Here he was faithfully following the methods of science. On the other hand, and here is the paradox, his architecture followed a diametrically opposite path. The design of the assembly building at Chandigarh shows that the causality between ideas and images we saw earlier, where ideas precede images, is completely reversed in architecture. It is the image that engendered the idea. The image precedes the idea. Let me explain. It has been widely reported that Corbusier's inspiration for the form of the chamber hall at Chandigarh Assembly has been the cooling tower of the thermal power stations at Ahmedabad or elsewhere for that matter. He too has alluded to this in his sketchbook. But it is not just a simple and sensuous form of the cooling tower. Corbu imagined in this industrial element a symbolic meaning. A cooling tower in its original context is an ordinary and utilitarian instrument, a part of a much larger industrial operation whose function is limited to cooling down the heated water for its recirculation into the process. In the assembly building, it is doing none of this. It is a seat of representative government. By placing it in the context of a political institution of an emerging nation with aspirations to be modern and industrial, it has been elevated as a symbol of the very idea of industrialization. The modernity and industrialization are now exemplified through this image. It has now transcended its original instrumentality and has metaphorically acquired an iconic status as a representational role for a much bigger idea. The image, in this case, the cooling tower, precedes and leads to the idea of modernity and industrialization. Its symbolization as something much more profound. The same can be said about this earlier proposal for the League of Nations headquarters in Geneva in 1927. The grand entrance porch conjures up the image of an entrance to a large modern railway station and not a stately formal porch that one would normally associate with such an institution, a global institution. But there already existed a typology for the entrance porch, a portico of an important public building. It was a grand single space fronting the main entrance where dignitaries were received one at a time. Only after the previous dignitary has been received and has been ceremoniously escorted inside, that another carriage carrying another dignitary could occupy the same space. Such a space spoke of a social hierarchy and a social and political priorities, thus conjuring up the image of a simple railway platform. At the League of Nations did several things at the same time. Besides the inevitable recollection of the spirit of industrialization and the new emerging suburban middle class that the invention of steam engine has heralded, and the very idea of railway was intertwined with the industrialization and suburbanization, this transpositioning of this utilitarian spatial element into ceremonial role also symbolized a far more equitable and egalitarian political order, where the heads of state and other dignitaries would arrive simultaneously and together with other non-dignitaries. It also aroused consciousness and criticized the prevalent norms. It was a political statement. I remember as a young architect in the early 1960s living in Ahmedabad, where Le Corbusier had built 4 of his buildings, often visiting the Milanese buildings on the weekend. One felt a sense of liberation and hope. Liberation from the neoclassical architecture one was fed at the school, and hope because it presented different way to conceive architecture. It opened up many windows of infinite opportunities. Here was a building for which Louis Mumford's description, healthily pregnant architecture, quote unquote, said in a different context, was quite appropriate. It speaks not only through the corporeal elements, the brise-soleil, the ramp, and the staircase, and all the other elements with which Corbu has composed this building, but also through the dynamic and ever-pulsating space that envelops you, draws you in, and prevents you from becoming just a distant observer only. The boundaries between the observer and the observed, between the subject and the object, are blurred. There was indeed a hint about the time, the world, which is not yet. And at the same time, it also held a mirror to the world we presently lived in. In that respect, it is precisely what Herbert Marcuse prescribed art to be, both affirmative and yet alienating. In other words, world within the world. What we have here in these three buildings by Le Corbusier is the phenomena of expression, wherein two terms, possession and exemplification, come into play. In the case of the assembly building at Chandigarh, while the form of the chamber hall possesses the property of being a cooling tower, it exemplifies the renewed relationship between industrialization, modernization, and democracy. Similarly, while the porch at the League of Nations possesses the property of a utilitarian railway station or a platform, because we are familiar with its function through conventions, it now exemplifies in the tangible form the intangible idea of a non-hierarchical democratic society. As Nelson Goodman says, what is expressed is metaphorically exemplified. What expresses a seat of democratic deliberation is metaphorically so. And what is metaphorically a grand porch is actually, but not literally, a grand porch. In the words of Goodman, and I quote here, the boundaries of expression dependent upon the difference between exemplification and possession, and also upon the difference between the metaphorical and the literal, are inevitably somewhat tenuous and transient, unquote. Let me illustrate this with architectural examples. Louis Kahn's Richards Medical Research Laboratories, as well as the Trenton Bathhouse, are both precursor and predecessors of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, in the sense that they too reverse the relationship between the profound and the trivia. In the case of Kahn, between the served and the servant spaces. While in the Paris building by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, the service elements continue to possess the property of just that, the service elements. Kahn has metaphorically exemplified and expressed these as significant components of an order of architecture in both his buildings. By turning the mundane into significant, he impregnated these utilitarian elements with new meanings. All these buildings, though the League of Nations was never built, arouse consciousness and thus are world within the world. Thus, while the polemicist in Le Corbusier adopted the prevailing norms and methods of science, the artist in him, and he was a great artist-architect, showed that it is indeed possible to imagine a rationality without aligning architecture with science and technology. Their rationality comes from that inner logic that drives their formal cause, the thoughtful arrangement of parts. And it is this logic that lends each of these buildings an unmistakable identity, an order, a world within the world. This notion of a world within the world is not new. Aristotle refers to it in his treatise on poetics. According to Aristotle, what characterizes any work, a tragedy, a musical composition, a building, a poem, or a painting, put together according to the rules of composition that originated in classical poetics and rhetorics, is its identity as something complete and whole, perfect, which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and whose particular order, its inner logic, sets it apart from its surrounding. It is like an organism, distinct from its environment because of its internal constitution and a strong demarcation of its limits, wherein nothing can be changed without changing the whole. Art thus brings to the fore, we may call it foregrounding, the order, and thus making it accessible to the human consciousness. Nelson Goodman's Worldmaking, an ordered work, is a world within the world. Every classical work is, in a sense, a temenos, cut out from the rest of the universe by virtue of its spatial order. To fashion this work is to make a world within the world. Indeed, this classical and Aristotelian rules of poetics and rhetoric lean heavily on geometry to set apart architecture, the world of man from the surrounding world of nature. The plans of the cities of Priene and Miletus are cases in point. Both planned by Hippodamus display geometry superimposed over a highly undulating terrain. These did express the supposed antagonism between man and nature in the initial stage of human consciousness. However, at no times this should lead to the belief that two worlds, that of man and that of nature, are at odds with each other. To the extent that architecture and urbanism deal with erecting the man-made world, they come directly in contact with the natural world. Accepting nature as a partner in this endeavor then would mean respecting nature and doing things in a way that nature would approve. The changing rhythm of seasons, the specificity of the location, the lay of the land, and what stands in the immediate and perceptible proximity becomes the determining factor for architectural decision, just as the innate nature of the material used in erecting the very physicality of architecture. This does not necessarily preclude geometry. The Greek city of Delphi, which predates Miletus, has a very different layout, much more in harmony with the surrounding nature, and where geometry finds accommodation with the lay of the land. Architecture is so specific to this location that it makes us think that it is part of the nature and has always been there. And yet, there is a logic which makes this human and cultural construct. It is this non-material logic that lends it an identity as a world within the world. These classical rules of composition originated in classical poetics and rhetoric and have evolved as principles of aesthetics through dialectical historicism of Logier, Perrault, and Baumgarten until the 20th century, as we saw earlier. Thus, modernism, as it has evolved since the invention of telescope, was the appropriate expression of modern era. It was Louis Kahn that brought in a significant paradigm shift from the prevailing historicist narrative. Kahn skirted around this historicist narrative and looked for meaning in the universal, fundamental, and immutable qualities of architecture, which are beyond or before history. Volume 0 of history, as he put it. He made a critical distinction between form and design. Kant's form comes closest to Aristotle's formal cause or Alberti's design. That which is non-material, non-physical, but which lend identity to a work of and its order. We have referred to this as the idea of architecture. This is beyond history and beyond intellectual articulation. It can only be sensed and resides in the silent zone of the mind. André Malraux, the French philosopher and art critic, refers to all arts as voices of silence. It can only be articulated through a laborious and sometimes frustrating process of design, which involves, in the words of Alberti, application of mind. I want to demonstrate this through two examples, both by Louis Kahn and which are extensively documented. One is Kahn's design for the Performing Arts Center at Fort Wayne. The project had 9 different components to be accommodated in a rectangular site. Kahn had to search for that which will give it an identity as a whole, an order which will also inform the design of each of these disparate components, elements of the program. Both the series of sketches, and these are small little doodles in order to figure out what way the plan works as a whole, as well as the sequence of models, show an intense search for that clarity which will inform architectural choices. It is arrived at through simultaneous explorations in plans and through models. Each of the plans in the sequence, as well as the models, seem to reveal an unexpected aspect of the space and gradually clarify what one is looking for. Kahn has recorded that the central courtyard, the plaza of the entrances as he called it, and which is actually the ordering element, revealed itself through this process only. When clarity is reached, the restlessness of the earlier sketches and models is replaced by confident order whereby everything has found a place and an inevitable position within the whole. And this inevitability, the rightness of the decision, can be arrived at, achieved only through the act of design. It is only when you see a sketch, a model, or hear a sound in music that you come to know what it is or what it is not. You had a sense of it. It was lying in the silent zone of your mind, but only now it finds its voice in that concrete image, the presence. You reject, accept, modify until you arrive at clarity about what it is that you've been looking for all this while. You had a sense of it, but only now you know. Like in the case of Le Corbusier's work we saw earlier, the concrete image precedes its articulation as an idea. The first Unitarian church by Kahn predates the project in Fort Wayne, and Kahn himself has extensively explained both the process and the inner logic. What I want to point out though is that the clarity of the order and therefore the sense of completeness and perfection, which marks it as a world within the world, was arrived at through a similar laborious and painstaking process wherein doing and thinking, making and questioning and conducting a critical dialogue with one's own work is a precondition. As the series of images show, the first initial sketch with concentric circles and a question mark at the center led to an almost literal and habitual transformation into a geometric resolution. It is geometry initially in the first stage that lent it the order and logic. It was the critical evaluation of these that resulted in the ultimate ordered arrangement of parts in the Aristotelian sense. But the interesting point is that geometry now is replaced by an inner logic derived from an intense identification with the very nature of the institution and the life of the community within. It is a transcendental logic. You see, for Le Corbusier, as we saw in the three projects earlier, it was the symbolic logic wherein expression is achieved through symbolic exemplification. In the case of Kahn, in Richard's laboratory, the Trenton bathhouse, the theater at Fort Wayne, or at the church at Rochester, the expression and the identity is achieved through a transcendental identification with the institution, which in turn leads to its formal exemplification in architecture. Whether it is architecture, music, or any other art form, it is this inner logic, the order, that gives it an identity and thus makes it a world within the world. And as Le Corbusier rightly said, creation is a patient search.